First performance criteria, turning on the microphone. Tick. Okay, everybody. Thanks very much for coming to the session this afternoon. My name is Kate Rogers and I look after climate finance at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. And also wear the hat of climate integration in the development program and food security and water sectors, so mixed portfolio. I'm going to moderate, that makes it sound like a debate, and it won't be. I'm going to facilitate this afternoon's conversation between our guests. But before I do, I just wanted to apologise that our Assistant Minister can't be here. You'll all be aware what's going on in relation to the negotiations, so she's been pulled off into that. So we'll push on. We've got a fabulous panel, and I think this is a really important discussion for us to be having. So just a couple of introductory remarks, and then I'm going to bring the panellists on stage and we'll start the proceedings. We are very keen to finish on time. We know everyone is very tired at this point in COP. So Australia is committed to working with our partners in the region to advance gender-inclusive climate action, including through our climate finance investments. And in fact, we have one that has a specific focus on climate and gender. That's Australian Development Investment. So I'm very happy to talk about that later on if anyone wants to know more. We know that women, when they're included in decision-making and in planning, bring a wealth of knowledge that can be harnessed to improve both climate and development outcomes. But we also know it can be difficult to achieve lasting changes in gender norms. So I think that's a really important point. Someone once told me that Homer Simpson said, and I can't verify the accuracy of this quote because it sounds a bit too intelligent for Homer Simpson, that it's hard to change, but it's harder not to change back. So you can judge whether you think Homer Simpson would have said that, but it's always stuck with me because I think it's a really accurate kind of description of some of the challenges in achieving lasting change in gender in particular, but probably very much also in some other aspects of inclusion. So panellists from the region will discuss the challenges they face in integrating gender and inclusion in climate action. They're going to highlight their achievements, and we are going to have a discussion around lessons and failures, in the hope that we can take from that something that we can put to work in our own work, in our own daily lives, if need be, to achieve better outcomes for climate and for communities. So, without further ado, I will introduce our illustrious speakers. And I'll call them up to the stage one by one. So we'll start with Veronica Nyland-Jones, who is the Global Head of Climate Capacity and Inclusion Accelerator for IFC, the largest global development institution focused exclusively on the private sector in emerging markets. Veronica, welcome. Warren Evans, Special Advisor Climate for Climate Change for the ADB. Warren is the ADB's Climate Envoy, the Office of the President. His priority focus is on scaling up and accelerating ADB investments in climate actions, reinforcing capacity development for climate change operations and strengthening ADB's external climate partnerships. It's a little bit like some of my role. Next, we will go to Sana Kapadia. Have I said your name correctly? Excellent. Who is the Director of Strategy at 2X Global. Sana is focused on leveraging capital as a tool for social change and unlocking more climate-smart capital at scale. Last but not least, we have Richard Fechner, the President and Global Leader for GHD Advisory. And Richard is now leading a global consultancy working across the nexus of the future of water, energy and sustainable communities. And I can see some of our water partners in the audience, so I'm sure they'll be particularly interested in what Richard has to say. So we only have 2 questions this afternoon. We wanted to give the panellists plenty of time to really ponder their responses and hopefully have some time for some questions from the audience. So I'm going to kick off with the first question. It's not a surprise, I haven't rewritten them in your absence. Slight look of panic just then. Can you identify an example from your experience of a transformative program or approach that has opened the door for effective integration of gender equality with climate action? And what was the key to success? Now, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Sana and we'll work our way that way.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to share. Before I dive in, I also just want to acknowledge that time that we're in. I just walked over from the Majlis Overflow, where they were bringing up some of the sort of sticky points around where the negotiation is at. And for me, what I get up every day and do the work I do is really driven by what I saw in that room and what I've seen in the last few days here, and seeing young activists and people who've been doing this for such a long time. And gender is material, it matters, and if we really want to sort of work towards a just transition, we need to be fully diverse and inclusive. So just want to open with that. At 2X Global, we are a membership-based field-building organization that's dedicated to unlocking gender-smart capital at scale. And what that means is we work with investors, for investors, to really activate their portfolios with this agenda of integrating a gender lens that is about advancing both financial and social outcomes. We're the home of the 2X criteria that has codified what it means to invest with a gender lens, as well as the 2X challenge. And our partners on stage have been part of that too, where we've deployed about 27 billion in gender smart capital over the last 5 years. As it pertains to the gender and climate finance nexus, one of the examples more recently that I was going to share is the Climate Gender Equity Fund that we launched in partnership with, USAID and Amazon seeded this fund, which has now reached $20 million at COP. And that's a great example of a public-private partnership. They seeded it, and then we've had Visa Foundation, Reckitt, and most recently UPS Foundation come along. 2X Global is the grant manager of that pot of money, and our first funding round was focused on supporting climate and gender fund managers, as well as ecosystem organizations, primarily in Africa, because that's where we were also noticing, and I think the data speaks for itself in terms of the need to fund those types of organizations. So it's a great example of really providing that catalytic capital that's needed to not only fund the solutions, because women are coming up with the gender and climate smart solutions, but also providing those fund managers with the warehousing and track record capital that they need to then also go and fund the solutions. So there's this lovely virtuous sort of circle of capital. And we're really excited that we were able to announce the first 3 grantees at COP, and there will be more. There will be more funding rounds. So that's a little bit of a glimpse of one example, and I'm very happy to dig in and share more, but I will pass for now.
Thanks for that. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, well, I might start with a bit of a story of history, perhaps, because I think one of my realisations this week is that it's no surprise cultural change takes a long time, but I had a real learning and a blast from the past this week. From my own history of implementing gender change through programs. So if you can jump in a time machine and come back to the late 1980s with me, and I was a young army officer who was seconded into the Vanuatu government to run water supply for a couple of years. And quickly learned in that there was a cultural gap in how the programs were being delivered from a range of donors. And that took then a journey of, changing from engineering to anthropology, and studying that in Melanesia, and then moving to how I implemented women, or got women involved in programs in a different way. And it took that cultural change of men accepting women having changing roles to get the first women trained as plumbers in villages. That was a 12-month journey or so. And so 1991, we had the first plumber certificates being passed across to women. And I was in the neighbouring hall a couple of nights ago, and bumped into Esleen Garabati, who leads the department that I was then part of. And so it was a good check-in to say, well, where have things gone in the last 30 years? And there has been progress, but I'm a pretty impatient kind of guy, and I was just, what struck me is the journey is far from ended. So if we cast forward to the Australian-sponsored Women for Water, or Water for Women, I get it right, program, where a large piece of that program is about cultural change. And that's covering countries, from in Asia, from Pakistan across to Fiji and countries in between. And so that's had a big cultural change piece, not just for the WASH program, but then bringing in things like menstrual health and hygiene, and how that's brought to the fore and just being seen as normal practice and changing practice and accepted. So that's then progressed now to making sure that intentional focus on gender in those traditional programs is now bringing in as part of it a climate change vulnerability piece for that program and the roles of women. And so again, I think it just needs that focus on understanding that. And I was in an ADB forum this morning where Warren introduced some of the sessions, and talking there about then the piece about climate change bringing changes to soil temperature and soil moisture, and then that linked into nutrition and productivity, which in many places exists in the woman's domain. And so that makes the jobs harder with climate change. And then the huge impost imposed with heat stress events, particularly for children, which adds to the problem. So I think that the events we've had in the last few years, and if it casts forward the same way, is having increased pressure on the roles of women. So how they're empowered to take some control as best and able to best manage is something I think all the programs need to bring forward, whether it be through finance, through programs and such like. It's a key piece going forward.
Thank you for that timely reminder of the importance of good gender analysis, time use studies, and women's preeminent role in agricultural production, particularly in the subsistence sector. Really important and deeply connected to the impacts of climate change and climate stress. Okay, thank you. Warren, over to you.
Thanks. For ADB, we try, about 2 years ago, we pretty much flipped our operations on its head and look at everything through a climate lens. We've been looking at everything through a gender lens, and where possible developing gender action plans. But now what we need to do is do a little bit more of a flip and look at everything through a climate gender lens. And particularly the experiences of the last 3 years, the floods in Pakistan, the heat waves that we've had, you name it, we've had every climate event, the glacial lake outburst floods in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We've had them all. And women and children are much more vulnerable and more affected. So we really need to rethink, and we just approved our new climate change action plan a month ago, and that has a very strong gender focus. So, but that's what ADB is doing. I want to make one point. The data clearly shows that when women are stronger in a national parliament, the climate action that's adopted by that parliament is stronger, more effective, greater mitigation measures, and more equitable adaptation measures. We have tons of experience that shows when we work in the natural resource area, natural resource management area, that the more empowerment that women have at the local level, the better the natural resources are used and conserved in a sustainable way. So it's a no-brainer that if we get more women here negotiating, then maybe they'll make a little more progress. Maybe. I'm going to tell one story that I think goes back, so looking at this historically a little bit. Bangladesh, as you all know, is very susceptible to climate impacts. They've been very susceptible to the kinds of ranges of monsoons that hit that country and the flooding and so on. So about 12 years ago, I think, we approved what we call a sector loan for Bangladesh, urban governance, and infrastructure. And a sector loan for us, it sets a series of criteria, and if a municipality meets those criteria, then they can get funding from the loan. So this started about 12 years ago. A big component of that was focused on empowering women at the urban level. And this has been so successful across Bangladesh that we're still doing it. Only now it's through what we call results-based lending. So they get the money when they deliver on the gender targets, and they get the money from the loan when they hit the gender targets. And it's probably just going to continue on because it's so successful. So it can work, it does work if you get it set up right, and we'll talk about some of the criteria later on. But I think that's probably our best long-term story that has a strong climate gender focus. Thanks.
Thanks, Warren. And I think the point you made about women parliamentarians and women in leadership generally, I think is a really critical point. You'll be pleased to know that we have a program that trains women climate negotiators in the Pacific, and there's over 106 that have been trained for that very purpose. And certainly that idea about finding out where those women have gone once they've stopped being climate negotiators, I think is a really interesting point, because I think that's a fairly consistent finding that women tend to be more focused on sustainability issues, on environmental issues. So thanks for that reminder. Okay, Veronica.
Thank you so much. So IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And I'm sitting here thinking, what can I share with you that I am certain this expert, interested audience doesn't already know? And I'm sort of throwing my notes to the wind a little bit, because you've made the effort to come out here late on I don't know what day it is, but you've come here late, and we're grateful. And so I'm going to not tell you how much money IFC is spending in gender and climate, because frankly, you can look that up. I will just say that we do a lot, and it's not enough. So we're doing a lot of gender investments. We're doing a lot of climate investments. When we're really good, they're coming together. That's not happening enough. So that's a big effort that we're making now. We did launch this week She Wins Arabia, which is, again, this idea of, can we please get more money in the hands of female founders and women-led startups, and can we please train fund managers to figure out how to make those funds accessible to those female founders who we know are going to be successful, and then do more matchmaking to bring them together. Because I think there's just a vast amount of misinformation to help these populations find each other, and find each other in a way that is credible, to give them each confidence and really unleash their full potential. And for me, it's really like, imagine if we had clean, emphasis clean, nuclear energy, and we chose not to deploy it. Like, that's what it feels like when we don't put money, real money, in the hands of women who are making climate decisions. That's just my own view. That is not an IFC statement. That's just, I feel like that is the scale of the untapped potential that we're missing. So I think what I'd like to see more going forward, in terms of your questions about the ingredients for success, we have all these initiatives that I think are, in each of them, demonstrating a good effect, like Climate to Equal, about getting women in climate decision-making on boards, Energy to Equal, or Power to Equal, where we're trying to infuse different kinds of green sectors with more women at all levels. But it actually was when we started applying a gender lens to every single one of our investments, to really try to mainstream it, which I have to say is like the least sexy thing to talk about up here, but that is really what started to make a difference. And then one investment officer at a time, one sector manager at a time, one client at a time, when we put gender on the menu of the services that they can get from IFC, embedded and integrated in their climate investing, they are so keen, and they just want somebody to walk with them and explain to them how they can do it. And what I'm talking about is not do no harm like our performance standards. It's really how do they go above and beyond to create additional shared value. And what is so inspiring to me is that how many clients really get that by creating value for women, they are likely to get a return for their company. And what I'd love to see going forward is at the asset level, we all talk about how there's not enough investment in adaptation and resilience. I really would like to help more companies understand that by investing more in the resilience of women locally, they will get a greater return for the resilience of their assets in the neighboring areas, as opposed to trying to invest in resilience at the asset level and then thinking about how that might spill over to benefit local communities and women. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I think this issue of investing in funds that target women, working with the investment community, if you like, to try to change norms. I think it's it's an issue that's ripe for further discussion. I've had some feedback during the course of this feels like very long period that I've been here on this issue, just around this sense of whether or not, because women, often women businesses are very much fixing problems that women experience. So they're addressing sort of issues that women identify that are a particular issue for them. I've heard some feedback that they're much more likely to be social enterprises and therefore less likely to be profitable and to be bankable. I'd just really like, if anyone on the panel does have a view on that, or any examples, it would be lovely to hear you rebut that kind of statement if in fact it does need to be rebutted. So I'll throw it open to anyone who has an answer.
I'm happy to start, and then Veronica, please do. So at 2X Global, we've produced through our network of members, basically, right? Our members are the ones investing. And so I can think of, for instance, at the start of this year, we did a report on inclusive climate and gender finance and what it might mean to really be thinking more deeply about supporting frontline marginalized communities. And for example, there was this one venture fund that's based in India called Upaya Social Ventures that works with scaling up some of the more early stage businesses. And yes, in that instance, those do happen to be social enterprises that may or may not be as, may not have as much capital intensive needs as some other enterprises. And then another example I would have to share is, for instance, the 22 fund in the US, led by Tracy Gray and her team, and they invest in very deep tech manufacturing that's all about clean energy, clean manufacturing, and they have, they're doing Series A, Series B rounds. So it is a full spectrum, and we see different examples. And what encourages me also is that we see different structures of capital and funds being put together that are actually more fit for purpose and are trying to meet the needs of the enterprises that women are building. So yes, some are about being venture ready, venture scale, and others are actually trying to do more impact-linked finance or revenue-based funding structures, more non-dilutive funding as well. So we do see across the globe different sort of structures being used, which goes to speak to the spectrum of enterprises out there. But Veronica, I'm sure you have other examples too.
I was actually going to head into a different space in terms of giving other examples of where, if it's okay to move beyond female founders, because one example that I really have fallen in love with is in Bogota, Colombia. There is a clean energy electric vehicle bus system, La Rolita, in Bogota, and Bogota has a female mayor. They have a female CEO of this La Rolita, and they have decided they want to have an all-female bus driving force of this e-bus system. And it is extraordinary in terms of the effort they're making to train women, but also make the environment more suitable for women. So recognizing that one of the big reasons that women weren't coming to be bus drivers is it's very hard to find a bathroom when you're a bus driver. And it's really hard to find a safe one on your bus route. So helping map out or setting up, clean, adequate bathrooms for female bus drivers is one step that the city, because they're in, it's run with the city, they're able to make these kinds of investments. Another issue was lactation. It's really hard to be a bus driver if you're nursing. So they set up lactation rooms in their headquarters, but also found, these kinds of clean spaces for women. What I think has been amazing is they're so successful. They have so many women now trying to become bus drivers, and I saw them at like a competitive, training where they then have to show that they are strong enough to be able to lift the part of the bus that like lowers for wheelchairs, and they like train women how they can build up their strength to do this. Anyway, it's become so successful. They're now also thinking they want to open it up to refugees who are in Colombia, and I think they have seen very strongly that the business has been more successful, right? That it's more lucrative. They're reaching more people this way, as opposed to it just being a social enterprise that serves, households. But very different end of the spectrum. So.
Yeah. And I'm really pleased that you gave us that example, because this is an issue. Climate change and the energy transformation. I mean, we know it's the greatest shock to our economic system since industrialisation, really, since the Industrial Revolution. And a shock like that is an opportunity to shake up gender norms. About what jobs women should be doing and what jobs women shouldn't be doing. It's a chance to sort of really turn some of those issues on their head. Or it could reinforce occupational segregation, and that would be a tragedy and a terrible waste of opportunity. So I'm really pleased to have had that example, and it kind of goes to Richard's earlier point around the backsliding about training women too.
Well, I'd like to build on the points that Veronica made. A few years ago, I did this is an Australian-based survey, but I did a survey of the sorts of university graduates that will be feeding into the future energy market. And while the proportions of women who are entering those degrees was much smaller than the males, when you looked at the academic performance, much, much stronger. And I'll make up the numbers now, but it was something like women might have been 20% of the students, but made up 85% of the honours graduates. And so, I think, it really comes back, if you're not including women in mainstream roles, no matter what the country is, then you might be taking second best, right? So how can we, address some of those gender norms of the past and really encourage in all countries that those mainstream roles leading to be, running the department, being the negotiator on climate, being the CEO of the bus company or the mayor, they should be normal expectations of all women, and break some of those. Now, I think it's natural that women may also be motivated towards those social enterprises. That's a good thing, but it's a good thing for everyone. But I think we've got to have that encouragement piece to stretch and grow, and so that piece of scholarship for women, I think, is a really strong enabler.
I agree with all that, and I think these are great examples of what is being done already, and clearly needs to be scaled up. For ADB, we're both sovereign and non-sovereign, so we have our private sector wing under the same, not near as big as IFC, under the same roof as our sovereign operations. So a good example of being able to make sure that you do help women generate jobs is, first off, you have to think about it ahead of time when you're designing programs, and you have to get the data, and you have to be very, very thorough in making sure that you pull together something that makes sense. But we started the Community Resilience Partnership Program a couple of years ago. Grant money from donors and ADB grant money as well. But that has a special window for women. So this is community decides what they need to invest in to be more resilient. The window for women is really about them being able to invest in profitable ventures that will help that community be more resilient. And that's then when our private sector wing can step in. A project that was just at the project level We had a project approved 2 weeks ago, private sector project, not huge, but private sector project in Mongolia for climate resilience in the cashmere industry. And that has gender targets that require that any investment through that has to be 50% women run. And so the training is built in there to enable the women. These are herders, and right now Mongolia exports the raw stuff, and we're trying to get them to process it, start making a little more money and a little bit smarter. So women running those businesses that are going to be processing. These are the kinds of things that there are lots of good examples, but we need to make it the norm. Right now, we can list 100 good examples, but we should be not having to give examples. It should just be what we do, and I think that's the challenge.
Thanks for those comments. And I think Warren makes a really good point that I don't know whether we're quite at the point yet where we can move away from targets. We certainly have a gender target in our development policy, and I think we're not quite there, and that suggests that it's not normalised. So, you know, the day should come when we don't need specific performance targets, but we're not there yet. I'll move on to the second question.
Can I just make one reflection to one thing, if that's all right?
Yeah,
because I love this point about what are climate jobs, like what are renewable jobs, and we all think of solar installers and these, or I gave EV bus jobs, but I was at the Nature-Based Solutions Coastal Resilience conversation yesterday, and the point was every job is going to be a climate job.
Yep.
If you're a lawyer, if you're a financier, I mean, whatever you're going to do, it's going to be a climate job. And so I think the opportunity is for us to say, women should be going into all of these fields, but I think women are so open to the idea of rethinking those traditional jobs because they haven't necessarily been in them for decades, to redesigning, as you say, how those jobs should evolve to be climate jobs as well. And I think that's something women would be very prepared to do.
And that goes to the point about having women at the table and in leadership positions, yeah. Okay, so that's the upside. Let's talk about the lessons and the downside. We'll see if we can shake out any lessons of failure. I'm prepared to share one from my experience, if you guys do as well. there's an incentive for you. So have you had approaches that haven't worked or caused harm? Why? And what are the lessons for all of us? So who'd like to go first? I'll let someone volunteer, someone brave.
I'll stick up my hand first.
Lovely.
But I'm telling a story that's not my own, so it's probably a bit safer in that way. But it's to do with microfinance, and there's one Asian opportunity where microfinance was put forward to set up female businesses, but the regulations, controls, training, and cultural change hadn't matched the ambition, and so a number of those businesses and the control of the businesses fell into men's hands, even though the loans were in women's hands. So the liability was sitting on a different side of the ledger. And that led to increased pressure on the women. It led to increase in domestic violence and an uptick amongst that cohort of women of suicide rates, etc. Yeah. So I think that's a pretty drastic outcome. So the objectives are good, but the framing of how to go forward, the controls, the regulation, the training, and the cultural awareness about that hadn't kept up. So I think it's a stark lesson of making sure that some of this is a long-term change. It needs that constant push, but we need to understand that do no harm principle needs to come forward, because sometimes best intentions can have unintended consequences, and really think through, like we're getting more mature now, say in looking at climate risk in everything that's done, there's gender risk to think about how that applies in a local context.
Thank you. And of course, those of us who've been working in development for a while know the mixed gender history of microfinance. Very good book by CGD that looks at the evidence on that. And you're absolutely right, Richard. I think there was some, it was a lovely idea in theory, but executed in a way that did lead to some perverse gender outcomes, and probably did create some harm in some instances. It goes to the value of really decent gender analysis, but also I think kind of using your eyes and looking. It's not just gender analysis, it's actually observing and looking at financial flows, where the money flows within households, and those intra-household issues around resource distribution, because often not observable to the person flying in, designing a project.
And that's where the local knowledge, the local understanding, and the cultural differences from country to country, region to region, language to language, have to be understood as part of the implementation and design.
Okay, any other volunteers on this one?
I might build on that one, because the example that was coming to mind for me it was in the development finance context, not my own example, but one I will share on behalf of someone in our community. And being in this space, the objective was to design a project finance structure that was going to support a community of women who were working on a menstrual health product initiative. And it was very much like, this is what's worked, let's do this, we'll do the gender analysis, we've heard what women want, but it still wasn't really listening, and it took the power of deep listening and building with the Indigenous women and the community to then actually take a step back and realize what they really needed was working capital. They didn't need large amounts of money, they needed, their supply chain was where things were stuck. And then being able to provide that type of funding at that point in time has then resulted in that community being able to build more product, get it out into market, and then scale to the level that was needed. But really being able to say, you know what, we got it wrong. We came with this preconceived idea of what we thought was needed, but actually this listening, being in community, understanding what was required, is what actually needed to happen to create that shift and to co-create, to collaborate and create something that's of real value. I think that's the thing, is really grounding this in what does shared value really mean. That reframe was essential.
I'm happy to share. I just don't want to hog the mic.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you don't have mine?
No, there you go.
Well,
It's
okay.
gonna be Warren.
So I'm not going to give a specific I can tell you what guarantees failure for ADB. Most of the gender action plans, which are maybe 30% of our lending, is suited to really having a strong focus on real action on gender. Those will fail miserably if we don't have government buy-in. If we haven't done the analytical work upstream, usually this is through a sector. So we need to understand at the sector level, and indeed at the it varies by geography as well as sector. So if we haven't done the upstream analytical work, if we haven't thought through how this is a fully integral component to the success of the investment, and if we haven't built in a budget to make it happen within the project, it's not going to work. And then increasingly what we're finding is that in countries where we have country offices in all of our, almost all of our developing member countries, if we don't have a pretty solid gender specialist who's watching over these projects and the investments, then the likelihood that it's going to slip and not work so well is much higher. So having on-the-ground monitoring, feedback, and kind of that in-house pressure is critical for us, because we are still making that adjustment. And then finally, key for us, and you mentioned this earlier, if we don't convince, train our project officers, our team leaders, the people who are pulling these investment projects together from the ADB side, if they don't buy into this, then they're checking the box, and that also dooms it to failure. So it really is making sure that we have the conditions right going into the investment itself for us, and then monitoring it very carefully. and having the data at the beginning, having the data at the end, and see whether or not we succeeded. Thanks.
Can I contribute to your list? I mean, I'll just say we've had lots of failures, and a lot of them I have experienced, but I've heard a lot this week, and I wonder how you all feel. I mean, your example and the outcomes were tragic and extreme, so I'm not making light of that in any way. And I've also heard people saying, if we're going to take the kind of action that's needed, we also have to innovate, and we can't innovate if we can't make any mistakes ever. And so there's a tension here, right? Because, I mean, these are people's lives, and we need to act. And so this is where we need help, figuring out how to get things right. And I totally agree that it's by having participatory design from the very beginning and accountability throughout also. I would love to hear more about accountability through all of our discussions in the last week. But I will give an additional example, which is in Peru, we had a very similar case of preparing communities for what was going to be a mining agri-boom and indigenous communities in the highlands. And it came to be clear very quickly that this was upsetting in the household. And we ended up designing a kind of a locally driven awareness campaign called in Quechua, but it was called Living Without Violence. And the reason I share that is because it wasn't like a anti-gender-based violence campaign. It was really trying to help the entire household imagine how they might enjoy just living without violence for everybody and how it would benefit the entire household. And I think this idea of we get so focused on giving resources to women, which I started this whole conversation with, but we always have to bring men along and help them see how this is to their benefit and that they also have a voice, and it's not prioritizing women at the sacrifice of men. And I think this is going to be increasingly important going forward. And in fact, going back to the e-bus story of La Rolita in Bogota, they couldn't get all the women they wanted immediately. They could only get to like 50%, so they have hired some men. And what they've learned is the men love the environment. They love the working environment that was designed to be more amenable to women. And they find it peaceful. It's very competitive now. They want to work there. They find it family friendly. They're contributing to solutions. So I think finding ways that this cultural shift is really for everybody, but with different people involved in the design. And the last thing I want to say on the gender-based violence, as we head into predictable, more scarcity and more competition over natural resources, we really need help figuring this out, because it's just going to lead to more conflict and more refugees who were.
Yes, and quite possibly, well, likely more gender-based violence in the household as well. I think those were some very good examples. I don't need to share mine now because you already have. That was a tactic. But I thought it might be useful. We finished the formal questions, but I think you've raised some really interesting issues around incentives and actually accountability. So we've got a lovely diversity of people here from different parts of the ecosystem, if you like. So I wanted to ask you, there are gatekeepers in women's access to finance. There are gatekeepers in the development of projects through MDBs, and they are the project officers, they are the bank officers, they are people who make little decisions every day that can have very large consequences for action for access to resources. There's a variety of ways that we've tried in the past to address this. In corporate Australia, there's things like the wage gap analysis that we do around men and women's pay, the pay gap analysis. There's positive incentives. There's special funds for women's projects or for access for women, as Warren highlighted. There are performance targets. what do you think we need to do to actually cut through? Gender has been mainstreamed and has been a priority in the MDBs for decades, and we're still having to use those tools. We've been talking about, the pay gap. We've been talking around women's access to finance for a very, very long time. What can we put in place to incentivise those people that make the small decisions? Over to you for bright ideas.
Well, in ADB, I can tell you very clearly you need the carrot and you need the stick. But you also need to empower people, and you need to give them the skill sets that are required to do this. If I look at, this is true when I was in the World Bank as well a little while back, if I look at the change from when we started talking about mainstreaming gender to where we are now, it's very significant, and we're doing a lot better. It's not the norm, but I actually think that climate change will drive it to be the norm, because as you said, everything will be related to climate change. And the risks that we look at from climate impacts, if we don't look at that through a gender lens, then we're not doing a decent job of looking at the risks. Internally in ADB, it's just about having accountabilities up the ladder. And so I sit in the office of the president. If somebody puts a proposal for a loan on our table now that clearly should have a strong adaptation component, and in the very near term is in a heat-prone area and doesn't have something to deal with the heat risk to women and children, then it'll go back down to the bottom of the ladder, and the questions will be asked why. And so it really is about empowering, giving the training. Increasingly in ADB, as I mentioned, it's about how well our country office functions. And a lot of our country directors are women who already get it. So we're seeing that change already. But it has been painfully gradual since this all started. But I do see now the kinds of investments we were just talking about becoming more the norm. And certainly understanding the issues is we're much better at now. So I'm actually pretty optimistic. I'm not optimistic on the climate front. That doesn't have anything to do with us. But I'm optimistic we'll do a much better job of truly mainstreaming gender, and not just mainstreaming, but prioritizing and looking for, what are the investments we need to be supporting now to make the change, as opposed to just mainstreaming. So that's really where we need to go.
I'm going to just make a comment as well that I think I was probably disappointed in some of the conversations this week of hearing some of the gender issues being stuck at like national policy in a country, and particularly in locations where there might be 3 levels of government, at a national, a province, and a local, and a lot of the issues and traction of improving well-being, climate risk, nutrition, anything else is very local. And so I think that the real key is about that empowerment and the voice at all levels concurrently, and really push for that enabling piece, because otherwise, filtering down from the top can be immensely slow and full of process and reasons of why not, rather than just making it the norm. So I think, the education, the training, the support, the access, the financing, the opportunity to raise a voice, the cultural change, it needs to happen equally across all. And when I've asked some of those questions, it's like, oh, well, we're working this policy first, then we'll go to the next level. And I can just see decades, and it goes back to my story I started with of 30 years ago. And some things have changed well, and some things are still a bit the same. So I think there's got to be a greater piece of hitting each of those elements of the totem pole, organisationally and culturally, at the one time.
Thank you. I might add from the asset owners whom we work with, and there's this initiative that we're doing in partnership with Criterion Institute, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs funded by Global Affairs Canada. It's called Advancing Research and Investment Standards for Equity. One of the things that's coming through from that for the asset owners is to shift what kinds of questions you might ask as an asset owner, and then have that filter down to asset managers, and then that gets down to the level of investment officers as well. And it's that creating a little bit more incentive alignment through that piece, but then going beyond. So it's going beyond the representation and diversity to what's the shift in process that we collectively need to do as an investment community for those better outcomes that we're working towards.
Totally agree with that. And very often it's even just lower the number of years of experience you're requiring from a CEO or from the business itself. It doesn't have to be that complicated, right, the shift. We now have a 40% target for IFC investments, that they need to be gender impactful, which is actually a big step up for us and very exciting. But to make that happen, the investment teams actually need new products to use with their clients, because to help them figure out how to integrate those ambitions into the financial services that they're offering. And so we're using a lot of sustainability-linked financing now, which is basically where the client gets their choice. They get a step up or a step down in the interest rate, depending on how they perform against ambitious, credible, benchmarked, science-based targets. And they can either be climate-related or they can be socially related. Ideally, they are both. And actually, they have been climate dominant in terms of, because companies have to work on mitigation, that's something that's easy for them to get their head around. So we actually articulated a guidebook on social key performance indicators in sustainability-linked financing as a menu for both our investment officers and our clients to say, if you're already doing sustainability-linked finance, you're already going through this very rigorous process, why not add a social ambition in addition to your climate ambition? So, for example, IZU in Turkey, they did an investment to increase their water efficiency as the water utility in Turkey, but then added a gender component in terms of training more women workers as well, and in real operational roles. So again, bus drivers and plumbing and other things. But then, in addition to giving them the menu, so we give them the target, then the product, the financial product, then the menu of how they can do it, and then we have to give them a team. So we say, okay, ask the client if they're interested, and then our team will show up and support you. And you don't have to figure it out yourself. You don't have to become an expert. You just call us and we'll come in and do all the heavy lifting with you. And I actually think that has been essential, and it's making it grow much faster.
I think that's an excellent example to wrap up on, because I think what that exemplifies is that at the moment we're all trying to lift our climate ambition and our climate integration, and there's an opportunity there to wrap that up with gender inclusion, to do both. So to have gender-informed climate mainstreaming, if you want to call it that. I think, has anyone ever used that term before? If not, I own it. I'll take that back.
I think that was Homer.
Okay, well, in that case, I don't own it. But that combination that tries to target the whole system. So, because I know that when you offer it, when you put a target in place and people don't actually have the mechanisms and the knowledge to address that target, that can present really big problems. So I love that example of the menu, the support, the TA, technical assistance to help implement, and then the discounted interest rate. That's nice. We'll take that one away, I think, because we're all in a world, I think, as donors, thinking very carefully about how we use grant aid. And I think climate has really been, the climate emergency, the climate crisis has really been a great impetus, I think, on all of us to really think very hard about our traditional model of delivering development assistance and delivering aid, and really, because the size of the financing gap is so large, those ways that we can use grant aid more effectively to work with the private sector, that's a great example of how we can do that and be a bit more creative about that process. So thank you very much. It is now 5:25, so I think I've done pretty well in keeping us on time. Warren has to go and close the ADB pavilion. If there was anyone with a burning question, we can take one. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. I'm opening the... Oh, there we go. One question. Can we take a microphone to you?
Thank you. I'm Mark Rubarenzia. Work with the Uganda National Road Authority. Great panel discussion. I was waiting to hear something about the girl child. We've talked about women. But taking from what Warren and the moderator said, we're discussing stories, cases, as opposed to the norm, which means we're just picking cherries. And I lean more with Richard, which is we need to be looking at generational change because of the culture I come from. You know, things take a generation. So does any of you know cases where we've had initiatives that target women, girls, and boys? Because that's when we're going to get systemic change. When these boys grow up, they won't do what their dads did. And the reason I bring this up is I also happen to be a Rotarian. I volunteer there. And Rotary in Uganda is now focusing on the boy child because the Uganda government about 40 years ago decided to prioritize education of the girl child. And so now the boy child is suffering. And you've got high rates of incarceration, high rates of joblessness, drug addiction, and this kind of thing. So by skipping the boy child and not focusing on their education, we've probably lost a generation. So that's the context in which I bring this question. I'll just throw it to the panel. Anyone?
That's a tough question to ask a panel that's focused on gender and climate change. Someone might have a view on that. I guess my sense of that issue is the targeting of girl children, particularly in education. It shouldn't be excluding boys. The point when we target girl children is to actually level the opportunity, not afford greater opportunity to one gender over another. So,
maybe if I could frame it better, the challenge was to see that girl child is given the same educational benefit. Was to see that the girl child is given the same educational benefit. But the bigger picture was that if you're to take education out of the father's hands into the mother's hands, she will then educate the girl and the boy. So that the gender lens was now seen as the girl, the boy, and the mother. But somehow the boy was skipped.
I thought you put it beautifully. I think it's an excellent point and a reminder to all of us. And I see it in my, own city in Washington, D.C., right? The way that boys are really being thrown to the wind, locally in many cases. And so I don't have a programmatic response to it, but I agree very much with the concern, and also that we don't want to be pitting boys and girls against each other in any way. And this is, a huge debate that I think we're trying to figure out what are the right answers to. I think also the focus on, in some ways it goes back to, that example of living without violence, right? How are we helping young people to understand just what a healthy home looks like, and how, boys are also allowed to be sad and be vulnerable and shed tears and, be heartbroken and hurt, and I think we're really paying the price for having not allowed that for so many years. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. That importance of having everyone at the table early, and we're not just talking about diverse genders here. We're also talking about people living with a disability, Indigenous groups, and the whole inclusion gamut. I mean, we've focused on gender and climate, but really it is about designing climate action for the people that actually live on the planet, taking full account of the people in all the diversity that live on the planet. On that note, we might have to wrap it up, but thank you very much, panel. It's been a really stimulating discussion. We really appreciate the energy that you've put into your answers late in COP and late on the day, and wish you all the best in your onward travels. I know some of you are leaving soon. Can everyone join me in thanking the panel? I think we probably have to, because that's the tradition.